Today we're going to be talking about annotating, and we're going to use the story The Secret Life of Walter Mitty to do so. Now, annotating is a process for reading which helps you to find important ideas and themes. It's also a skill that will help you remember things because as you read, you write, and we remember a lot more when we're writing things down. As you learned in the lesson on reading strategies, you always want to read your story completely through once before you start doing any of these processes. When you annotate, when it's time to annotate, decide ahead of time what it is you're looking for. If you don't know what you're looking for, you're going to end up highlighting everything, and then you're going to get no information that is going to be useful for you. Now, for instance, when you annotate a textbook for science, you might be looking for terminology or processes. When you annotate a literary text, you're looking for things like characters, setting, some kind of aspect of theme, something that has to do with the storytelling. So we're going to look at character, specifically character development. And we're going to look at the character development of Walter Mitty. Having read the story, you're already aware that Walter alternates between fantasy and reality. What you might want to do is just highlight or put brackets around the side of the paper of when Walter is in a fantasy and when he is in reality. This will help keep the story a little bit more straight. The other thing that you do when you're reading is you consider simple questions before you start annotating. Things like, who is Walter Mitty? What does he do? Who are his friends? Is he happy or sad? These types of questions will help you focus when you first start reading. Once you've looked at some simple ideas, you want to get a bit more complex because as you do writing, you want to develop complex ideas. It's not enough to simply look at what happened and who did what. So complex questions would be things that don't have simple answers. Things like, does Walter Mitty develop as a character, or does he stay relatively the same? Has he gained some understanding or insight over the course of the story? Is that ending happy or sad? Maybe the ending isn't actually happy or sad. Maybe it just doesn't change at the end. These are the types of things that you want to get to as you annotate the story. Now, whenever you're expressing an opinion about a character or a theme, and that's what you're looking at, is developing the character towards a theme. You need to gather evidence to support your opinion. The evidence comes straight out of the story. The things that you're looking at to gather your evidence, and there's basically three that we're going to break down here: dialogue, thoughts, narration. When you look at these things, you can gather evidence to support what you believe the character is doing, how the character is developing, and what ultimately the theme of the story is. Remember, the theme is the author's opinion, the author's lesson that he wants us to learn about the development of human nature. When you consider Walter Mitty, you might ask yourself, why does a grown man have such an active fantasy life? There are plenty of clues in the story that you can use to support a variety of responses to this question. We're going to look at the first 3 paragraphs of the story, and I'll annotate on the board as we go. After you watch the video, I want you to complete an assignment where you annotate several paragraphs from this story on your own. All right. So we look at this story, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to isolate the areas that are fantasy and the areas that are reality. So having read it already, I know that this first part is the fantasy, the second part is the reality. I'm just going to note that on the side so I don't forget. So in the fantasy, which is the beginning of the story, we get an interesting little thing going on with Walter. Now what I want to do is I want to isolate words that are unique or precise, something that is very descriptive. This is a good idea anyways, because when you write essays, you want to make sure that the language that you're using to express your opinion is precise. Try to avoid general terms that don't really give you a lot of information. So, what do we know about Walter Mitty? Well, I'm going to look at the physical descriptions, how people are reacting to him, any words that the narrator uses to tell me how he's talking or moving. So, I know that how he's dressed. He's in full dress uniform. Okay. And I know a lot more about the uniform. I know it's heavily braided with a white cap. I note as well that the cap is worn in a very specific way. It's not just tossed on his head. It's pulled down rakishly over one eye. Okay? And I also have a description of the eye. Cold gray eye. Okay? So I get a little bit about how he's dressed, as well as something about his eye color, and specifically it's a cold gray. Okay? So I'm going to look at that a little bit later. What else do we know? Well, he's having a conversation here with people. Now, the conversation itself, you don't have to underline everything, because you want to underline, as I said, specific things that you're going to remember. But I note from the conversation that it's a back and forth between the commander and his men. I can look at things like exclamation marks. Okay, how often are they used? Who's using them? Exclamation marks indicate that somebody is talking excitedly. Okay. So I know that this is a fairly exciting section. There is a lot of activity going on. I'm going to skip through a lot of the conversation and look for more terms that will help me. Okay. I note at the end, and we can skip right to the end here, the old man ain't afraid of hell, just a little bit above it. The old man will get us through. These are things that the crew are saying about Walter Mitty, about the character in the fantasy. I also note they refer to him as the commander. He's not just a friend, he's not just a boss, he has a title. All of these things tell me something about the man in this story. Okay. So what kinds of things do we learn? Well, a commander is somebody who is highly respected, fairly high up in a command position. When I look at how the commander is dressed in a dress uniform with a braided white cap, this is not something I would normally expect to see in an instance where they seem to actually be fighting something. We know that they're in the middle of a hurricane, they tell us in their conversation. But he seems to be in a uniform that you might wear to a fancy ball, as opposed to taking off in a plane to fly through a hurricane. Okay. What else do we know about him? Well, we know that the commander seems to be the only one in charge, the only one who's calm. The men seem to be a little panicked. But if you take a look at some of the things, some of the ways that the commander is moving, okay? He doesn't run through the plane in a panic. He walked. He's shouting at the men because he has to get his voice heard over the hurricane. But he's not really in a panicked position. What else? He stares at the ice. Okay, and where's the ice? It's forming on the window. But he's not panicking about this. He just stares at it. Okay? So the way he's reacting tells us that he is very much in charge and not afraid. And yet his men, for most of this section at the top, seem to be afraid. But when we get down to the end, oh, they're grinning. And they say to one another, the old man will get us through. So they have a great deal of confidence in the commander, which again tells us something about the commander himself. So in the fantasy, Walter appears to be a very intelligent, very well-versed commander. He's almost heroic in the way he's described. Okay? It's a very rich kind of a fantasy life. Notice at the end of the fantasy, there is an indication that we're about to go into reality. And you'll note this throughout the story. These 3 little dots, they end and begin the fantasy sections. We call this an ellipsis. Okay. An ellipsis is simply these 3 dots that indicate something is being left out. Sometimes we use it in writing when we're doing essays and we have a long section we want to write in, but there's maybe stuff in the center that's not really that necessary. So you write the beginning and you put the 3 little dots in and you write the end. And that way you can isolate specific terms that are important to you. But the ellipsis in our story indicates that something is being jumped away from. Okay? The fantasy is ending. So what happens? Well, this is where we get the reality section. Okay? We jump into reality. So let's take a look at Walter's reality and see how it compares to his fantasy life. Well, the first thing we see in reality is there's a Mrs. Mitty. So we know Walter is married. Right? He is not a single man. He's married. What's the first thing his wife tells him? He's driving too fast. Okay? So she wants him to slow down. In fact, she wants to know why he's driving so fast. Okay? That might be a logical kind of a question for somebody in a car to ask. So what's Walter's response? So again, when you're looking at character development, you not only look at how characters act, but how do they respond to the other people in the story? Well, first thing Walter does, he doesn't seem to be paying attention. He says, I'm not quite sure. He kind of drags him back in from his fantasy life. Okay? And then he looks at his wife. Now, this is an interesting section. Normally you would look at your wife with love and caring and consideration. He looks at her with shocked astonishment, okay? As if he's been dragged away from something he didn't want to leave. And truly he has. He's been dragged out of his fantasy and into this reality. But shocked astonishment, an interesting way to react to your spouse. Then we hear that she seemed grossly unfamiliar. So as if he doesn't even recognize her. Look at this. A strange woman. Somebody, he's just not sure who she is. And what's she doing? She's yelling at him. Okay? As if this is somebody in a crowd who just yells at him. Somebody he is completely unfamiliar with. So in coming back to his reality, he almost seems like the fantasy is true to him. As if the reality is the thing that's untrue. So that tells us something about Walter. Okay? His fantasy life is a little bit more important to him than his reality. And we go down a little further in here. We find out from his wife he was driving 55 miles per hour, that is, which is actually a fairly significant speed. She tells him that she doesn't like to go more than 40. She's telling him what he should be doing. This is very, very different from his fantasy where he tells everybody else what they're supposed to be doing. He does not seem to have the same control in his reality that he does in his fantasy. What else do we learn in the reality section? He drives in silence. After his wife tells him that he's supposed to slow down, he just continues in silence. Notice he's not talking back to her. He's not telling her 55 is a safe speed. He doesn't tell her to be quiet. He simply accepts what she says to him. The roaring through the worst storm in 20 years. So this is him going back to his fantasy, that the plane that he was in is fading away into the background because his wife has dragged him back into reality. Okay. The next thing his wife says to him is important as well. You're tensed up again, she says. Notice the word again. This implies that this is something that happens frequently, that he's relaxed and then he tenses, and then he's relaxed and he tenses. What this suggests to us as the reader is that his fantasy life is something that happens frequently, that this is something he goes back and forth to, and the time that he's tense is when he's in reality. But he's very relaxed and calm when he's in his fantasy life. She tells him, I wish you'd let Dr. Renshaw look you over. So she thinks there's something wrong with him. So what we see in comparing his fantasy to his reality is that he seems to be quite powerless in reality. His wife is clearly in control here, but he is clearly in control here. That gives us a focus for Walter. It gives us a beginning to look at in, will he ever become the kind of a man in reality that he appears to be in fantasy? Will that confident, commanding person from his fantasy life ever bleed through into reality? And can he be happy if he's only satisfied and in command in his fantasy and never in reality? What kind of ending is Walter Mitty going to have? That's something you'll be looking at. So now that you've seen how annotation works and you've got an idea of how you can do it yourself, I want you to turn to Activity 5 in Unit 1 and continue annotating the secret life of Walter Mitty.